The weapons locker was empty. Not broken into, not ransacked. The magnetic seals were still engaged, the audit logs showed no access events, and the security footage from the past 72 hours was entirely intact. Every frame accounted for, every timestamp verified. The locker was simply empty. Veth Kalos, third arbiter of the Interstellar Compact's Arms Regulation Directorate, stood in the corridor of the human installation on Meridian Station and stared at the smooth, featureless interior of a sealed container that should have held 47 regulated munitions and had, according to every verifiable record, never been opened. He did not understand how this was possible. He had not understood many things about humans in the 4 months since the Compact had formally classified them as a category 7 psychological hazard, dangerous not in the traditional sense, not because of their technology or their numbers or their territorial aggression, but because of something in the way they thought, the way they made decisions, the way they looked at situations that should have produced paralysis and instead produced movement. The empty locker was the third inexplicable thing he had documented this morning. It would not be the last. The formal declaration had come 8 days ago, though the argument behind it had been building for considerably longer. Veth Kalos had been present at the Compact Assembly when the vote was taken. He remembered the way the chamber had felt, the particular quality of certainty that fills a room when 9 sovereign civilizations agree on something, the kind of agreement that feels less like consensus and more like gravity, inevitable, permanent. The human species, Arbiter Prime Chauvin had announced to the assembled delegates, has demonstrated persistent incompatibility with regulated armament frameworks. Their decision-making patterns, crisis response behaviors, and documented willingness to accept catastrophic self-harm in pursuit of tactical objectives make conventional weapons oversight protocols functionally unenforceable. A translator had been present for the 2 human observers allowed in the gallery. Veth Kalos had watched their faces while the declaration was read. They hadn't looked outraged, they hadn't looked frightened. One of them, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and a scar along her left jaw that Veth Kalos had never quite stopped noticing, had tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when they're listening to something they've heard before in a different language. The other one, younger, had written something in a small physical notebook, with a pen, an actual pen on actual paper. Veth Kalos had found that detail strangely disturbing and had not been able to explain why. The declaration had passed 9-0. Humanity was formally, legally, diplomatically prohibited from acquiring, manufacturing, or possessing any weapons system above Class 3 on the Compact's regulation scale. Their existing military hardware would be inventoried, cataloged, and placed under Directorate oversight within 90 days. Any human vessel carrying armaments above the approved threshold would be subject to immediate interdiction. The human observers had listened to all of it. Then they had left the gallery without saying a word. What did they write? Veth Kalos had asked his assistant Dren Sala afterward, the younger one with the notebook. "We don't know," Dren Sala had said. "We couldn't see the page." "Get a spectrographic analysis of the notebook if it comes into Directorate possession. I want to know what they considered worth writing down." Dren Sala had given him the look that junior Directorate staff gave when they suspected their superior was over-calibrating for a threat that wasn't there. "Arbiter, there are 42 ships and a handful of stations. We have 9 civilizations with combined fleet strengths in the thousands. The declaration is precautionary." "They're not." "The locker," Veth Kalos said. Dren Sala stopped. "When you have an explanation for the locker, I will recalibrate." Veth Kalos turned back toward the empty container. "Until then, assume I am not over-calibrating." The human they'd assigned to liaise with the Directorate inspection team was named Kasia Oren. She was the one with the gray hair and the scar, the one who had tilted her head during Arbiter Prime Chauvin's declaration, as though filing it under a category she already had a name for. She was cooperative, extraordinarily cooperative. She answered every question immediately, provided documentation without being asked twice, and maintained an expression of steady, professional neutrality that Veth Kalos had been trying to interpret for 4 days without success. "The locker," he said when she joined him in the corridor. "Walk me through the inventory process." "We submitted the inventory 48 hours before your team arrived," she said. "Everything on the list was present at time of submission. And now it isn't." "No. The seals were never broken." "That's what your logs show." "Your logs as well." "Yes." Veth Kalos looked at her. "You're not surprised." "I'm cooperative," she said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. "What was in that locker, Lieutenant Commander Oren?" She handed him a datapad. The manifest was thorough, professionally formatted, exactly as required by compact regulations. He read through it and understood immediately that it told him almost nothing he actually needed to know. "This describes what was registered," he said. "That's correct." "Is there a difference between what was registered and what was in the locker?" She met his eyes. "The inspection protocol requires us to disclose registered items. We disclosed everything registered." 3 seconds of silence. "I see," said Veth Kalos, though he didn't. Not yet. But something behind his sternum, whatever passed for intuition in his species, had begun making a sound like a warning tone. He had at that moment 3 mysteries he couldn't resolve: the empty locker with the sealed locks, the notebook he'd never read, and the expression on Kasha Oren's face, which was cooperative, professional, and completely, utterly unafraid. He would spend the next 6 days trying to understand why. The inspection of Meridian Station took 4 days. In that time, Veth Kalos documented 11 anomalies he couldn't explain. Not illegalities, not violations, anomalies, things that fell within the letter of the Declaration's requirements and yet somehow felt wrong in a way he couldn't formally articulate. A fabrication bay that was registered as a food processing unit and functioned exactly as described, but whose power consumption patterns suggested a secondary operational mode that the station's engineers couldn't account for and cheerfully blamed on aging infrastructure. A data system that met every transparency requirement the compact mandated, and yet, when his technical team ran a depth analysis, appeared to have significantly more processing capacity than its documented specifications suggested was possible. A crew manifest that listed 48 personnel. Veth Kalos counted 48 personnel. He was fairly certain he had seen some of them twice, in different parts of the station, at times when the travel distance between locations would have made that impossible. "Are you rotating crew for the inspection period?" he asked Kasha on the 3rd day. "All crew are available for your review," she said. "That's not what I asked." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He submitted his initial report to the directorate that evening. He categorized all 11 anomalies as *inconclusive, pending further analysis, a designation that meant, in practice, that he believed something was happening and could not prove what it was. Drensala flagged 3 of his entries and sent a note that read, "Arbiter, I think you may be seeing patterns that aren't there. These are a primitive species with 42 vessels. We have 9 civilizations watching them. Please recalibrate." Veth Kalos read the note twice. Then he pulled up the power consumption logs for the food processing bay again and stared at them for a long time. He found the second anomaly cluster on day 4. He had started, the night before, cross-referencing the maintenance logs against the station's structural blueprints. It was the kind of obsessive detail work that his colleagues had always found excessive, the kind that had made him a good arbiter and an exhausting dinner companion. At 3:40 station time, he found it. The blueprint showed 17 storage compartments on sublevel 3. The maintenance logs referenced 23 compartments. The discrepancy was buried in a routine ceiling report, formatted to look like a rounding error in a dimensional survey. 6 rooms that didn't officially exist. He did not wake Drensala. He took a handheld scanner and went to sublevel 3 alone, because he was not yet certain what he would find, and he was very certain he wanted to see it before anyone else did. What he found was not weapons. It was people. 12 humans in a compartment that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, who looked up when he opened the panel with the expression of people who had been expecting to be found and had decided how they felt about it. Around them, cots, water supplies, 6 months of compressed rations, and what appeared to be a fully functional communications array. And books, physical books, dozens of them. Vethkalos stood in the doorway for a very long time. The youngest of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, by human aging standards, held one of the books open on his lap and watched Vethkalos with calm, dark eyes. "You're the arbiter," the boy said. "Yes. We figured you'd get here eventually." He didn't look away. "Are you going to report this?" "I don't know yet what this is." "This," said an older woman near the back, without looking up from something she was assembling with small tools, "is a library." Vethkalos looked at the communications array. He looked at the compressed rations. He looked at the water recyclers and the air processors, and the structural modifications that had carved 6 rooms out of the station's dead spaces with surgical precision. "That is not all this is," he said. "No," the woman agreed, "but it's the part that matters." He reported it. He reported everything, the hidden compartments, the people, the supplies, the communications array. He submitted the full documentation and waited for the directorate's response. The response came in 6 hours. It classified the finding as a * humanitarian shelter installation under Compact Code 7.4, which technically permitted civilians to maintain emergency refuge spaces aboard stations regardless of armament restrictions, provided no weapons were stored therein. No weapons were stored therein. The directorate ordered him to seal the compartments and move on. Vethkalos sealed the compartments. He moved on. But that night, lying in his bunk aboard the directorate inspection vessel, he thought about the communications array. Compact Code 7.4 permitted humanitarian shelter installations. It said nothing about the communications specifications of those installations. The array he had found was capable of reaching. He ran the numbers in his head. 11 of the 14 inhabited systems within the compact's outer boundary. He thought about that for a long time. Then he thought about the notebook. Then he thought about Kasia Oren's face, and the specific quality of her stillness, and the way she had said "I'm cooperative," as though it were a category of behavior, not an emotional state. He got up, pulled out his own notebook. He had started keeping one after the inspection began, because there was something about physical writing that made him think more carefully, and wrote a single sentence. "They are not preparing to fight. They are preparing for something they expect to survive." He looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he wrote a second one, smaller in the margin. "What do they know that we don't?" 3 days later, the compact received the first signal from the Dairon hegemony. Vethkalos was aboard his inspection vessel, already 2 systems out from Meridian, when the emergency broadcast reached his communications officer. He was in the middle of dictating an anomaly report. He stopped mid-sentence. The Dairon hegemony had not communicated with the compact in 11 years. The Dairon hegemony, the last time anyone had heard from them, had been in the middle of a territorial consolidation that the compact's political analysts had called aggressive but manageable. The Dairon hegemony, according to the emergency broadcast, had just entered the Veth corridor with a fleet of 314 vessels. The Veth corridor led to 18 inhabited systems. 14 of them were compact members. How current is this signal? Veth Kalos asked. 6 hours, Arbiter. Propagation delay. What is the compact fleet's current positioning? His communications officer pulled the data and said nothing for a moment. Then, Arbiter, the compact fleet's primary engagement force is positioned at the shale margin. That's in the opposite direction. I know where the shale margin is. The repositioning time, even at maximum. I know. He sat down very slowly. He looked at his hands. Get me Arbiter Prime Chauvin, he said. Priority channel. He's already on emergency conference. Then get me someone who can explain how the primary engagement force ended up on the wrong side of the galaxy. Nobody could explain it. The repositioning had been gradual, a series of individually reasonable deployments over 14 months, each one defensible in isolation, which in aggregate had produced a catastrophic gap in coverage. The kind of gap that would only look like a gap once something was already moving through it. The compact had 312 hours before the Dairon Advance Fleet reached the first inhabited system in the Veth corridor. They had 41 functional warships within response range. Veth Kalos pulled up the fleet inventory. He read through it twice. His hands had stopped moving. Communications, he said quietly. Arbiter. Pull up the human fleet registry. Current status of all 42 vessels. A pause, then, Arbiter, that registry was last updated during the inspection. Under the declaration, human vessels are required to file position reports every 72 hours. The most recent reports show, another pause, longer. Arbiter. Yes. 37 of the 42 vessels are showing positions consistent with the last report, movement within expected parameters. He had noticed the phrasing, and the other 5. They're not on the registry. He thought about that. They didn't file. They filed. The positions they filed are, the communications officer's voice had taken on a quality Veth Kalos recognized. It was the quality of someone discovering they had made an assumption and finding out what was underneath it. The positions they filed are physically impossible, Arbiter. They show all 5 vessels in 3 different locations simultaneously. The timestamps are consistent with compact verification protocol, but the positions cannot all be true, Veth Kalos finished. No, they cannot. He stood up again. He walked to the viewport. Outside, the familiar spray of stars, familiar, known, mapped. Contact Meridian Station, he said. Get me Lieutenant Commander Oren. She answered on the second ping. You saw the Dairon signal, she said, not a question. Yes, he paused. Where are your 5 missing ships, Lieutenant Commander? The pause on her end lasted exactly long enough to tell him she had been expecting this question and had decided, sometime before he asked it, how much she was going to answer. They're where they need to be, she said. That is not an answer. It's the answer I can give you right now. The compact has a Dairon Advance Fleet entering the Veth corridor, he said. We have 41 vessels in range. If you have ships in the Veth corridor. We have a few things in the Veth corridor, she said. What does that mean? Another pause. Arbiter Veth Kalos. 8 days ago, the compact voted to disarm us. Said we were too psychologically unpredictable to be trusted with weapons. Said our decision-making was dangerous. A beat. Were you in the room? Yes. Did you vote? Arbiters are non-voting members of the Assembly. But you were there. Yes, I was there. Then you'll understand, she said, that there are some things we're not currently obligated to tell you. The line stayed open. He could hear, in the background of her signal, the particular acoustic signature of a combat operations center, the low-frequency hum of active systems, overlapping voices at controlled volume, The specific kind of quiet that isn't quiet at all, but is people working very fast and very deliberately. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "are you already fighting them?" The line stayed open. She didn't answer. The next 14 hours were the most disorienting of Veth Kalos's professional life. Reports arrived from 6 different sources, none of them consistent, all of them describing things that didn't fit any tactical framework he had been trained to use. A Dyran forward scouting cluster, 12 vessels, had ceased communications 7 hours ago after reporting contact with an unidentified obstacle. They had described the obstacle as asterisk, not a ship. Their last transmission had contained a phrase that resisted direct translation, but that the Compact's linguistic team rendered, uncertainly, as suspended architecture. 2 Dyran patrol vessels operating independently of the main fleet had both reported navigational interference in the Veth corridor's second transit lane. When the Compact's own sensors interrogated the same region, they found nothing. No ships, no debris, no interference, just empty space that somehow continued to produce navigational interference for Dyran vessels while being entirely transparent to Compact sensor arrays. A Dyran communications relay positioned at the corridor's mouth had gone silent. No explosion, no distress signal, no detectable cause, just silence. "They're not using weapons," Drensala said, standing in the doorway of Veth Kalos's cabin with a tablet and an expression that had moved well past its earlier skepticism. "If they were using weapons, we'd see energy signatures. There's nothing. No heat bloom, no radiation scatter, nothing." "I know." "Then what are they?" Drensala stopped. "The fabrication bay." "Yes." "The one registered as food processing." "Yes." "What were they making in there?" Veth Kalos looked at his notebook, at the sentence he had written 6 days ago. "They are not preparing to fight. They are preparing for something they expect to survive." He had been right. He had just misread the direction. They hadn't been preparing for survival. They had been preparing the corridor. For 11 months, possibly longer, certainly starting well before the Compact's declaration, possibly starting the moment the first political signals suggested the declaration was coming, they had been seeding the Veth corridor with something. Not weapons, not ships, something that didn't appear on sensors, something that disrupted Dyran navigation while remaining invisible to Compact arrays. Something assembled quietly in a food processing bay and transported in small pieces aboard 42 registered vessels, making entirely legitimate transit runs through systems that happened to include the Veth corridor. The 5 missing ships weren't fighting. They were maintaining the infrastructure. They knew, Drensala said quietly, they knew the Dyran were coming. Or they knew something was coming. They might not have known what. And they built a trap, a maze. What is it? "I don't think it's a trap." Veth Kalos stood, moving toward the viewport again. "I think it's a delay mechanism. They can't fight 314 Dyran warships. They know they can't. So they built something that slows the advance fleet down, disrupts their navigation, makes them careful, costs them time." "Time for what?" "For us to reposition our fleet." Silence. "They're buying us time," Drensala said. "A species we just declared too dangerous to arm is buying us time with infrastructure we can't explain, built using technology we didn't know they had, using resources they must have been moving for nearly a year." "Yes." "While we were watching them." "While we were watching them." Another silence, longer this time. "Arbiter," Drensala's voice had changed. "If they knew the Dyran were coming, if they've known for months, why didn't they tell us?" Veth Kalos turned away from the viewport. "I think," he said slowly, "that is a question we should have asked ourselves before the vote." Arbiter Prime Chauvin's emergency communique arrived 90 minutes later. It was not a request. Compact Protocol didn't have a mechanism for the Arbiter Prime to make requests of a Category 7 hazard species. The Declaration had removed that diplomatic pathway intentionally. What Chauvin sent instead was technically a Joint Operational Inquiry asterisk, which Veth Kalos recognized as the political equivalent of turning to someone you'd insulted at a party and asking if they could reach the shelf you couldn't. He forwarded it to Meridian Station without comment. Kasha Oren's response arrived 47 minutes later. Veth Kalos read it 3 times. It was 2 sentences long. We are aware of your operational situation. We will help, but we need to talk about the declaration first. He stared at the second sentence for a long time. Then he put his jacket on, walked to the bridge, and asked his pilot to set course for Meridian Station at maximum safe velocity. How long, he asked. 11 hours, Arbiter. 11 hours. He sat down in the navigation chair and pulled out his notebook and thought about the boy with the calm, dark eyes who had been sitting in an undocumented room with a book on his lap, waiting to be found. You're the Arbiter. Yes. We figured you'd get here eventually. Not I thought you'd never find us asterisk. Not how did you get in here. Not fear or surprise or any of the normal reactions of people discovered in places they weren't supposed to be. We figured you'd get here eventually. As though discovery had always been part of the plan. As though the hidden rooms weren't meant to be permanent. As though the entire 4-day inspection had been a performance, running alongside another process he hadn't seen, designed to be discovered at exactly the right moment. He wrote in his notebook, what was the inspection supposed to make us believe? Then he wrote, what did it actually accomplish? He didn't have answers yet, but somewhere in the 11 hours between now and Meridian Station, he suspected the shape of the answer was going to become visible, and he was not going to enjoy seeing it. He arrived to find Meridian Station in controlled chaos. The docking bay had been reconfigured, not dramatically, but noticeably, in the particular way that spaces change when people who know what they're doing are moving fast through a clear objective. Equipment had been redistributed. Several corridors had been sealed and rerouted. The cafeteria had apparently been converted into something else. Through its porthole windows, he could see banks of screens and at least 30 people at workstations. A young man he didn't recognize met him at the docking collar. Early 20s, human, with the specific kind of focused calm that Veth Kalos was starting to recognize as a human performance rather than a natural state. Arbiter, I'm Ensign Kale Murin. Commander Oren asked me to bring you directly to operations. The cafeteria, Veth Kalos said, nodding at the window. Yes, sir. What happened to the food? Kale Murin looked at him with an expression that was almost a smile. We ate it. Kasha was at the center of the operations room, standing at a holographic display that showed the Veth corridor in 3 dimensions. Her hands were moving through it with the ease of someone who had been working this particular map for a long time. She looked up when he entered. Arbiter, good travel. Adequate, he stopped at the edge of the display. The corridor. Yes. Show me. She moved her hands and the display expanded. He saw the Veth corridor in full, the transit lanes, the gravitational topology, the Dyran Advance Fleet's last known positioning, and overlaid across the entire thing, in a color that the display's legend identified only as asterisk installed infrastructure asterisk, a web. Not a weapon, not a minefield, a web. Thousands of nodes, spread across 600 million kilometers of transit space, each one, according to the display's technical readout, approximately the size of a human fist. What are they? He asked. Navigational ghost emitters, she said. Each one broadcasts a false gravitational signature on a rotating frequency. To Dyran sensors, their sensors specifically, tuned to their detection band, each emitter looks like a stellar mass. A rock, a station, a ship, something that requires navigation adjustment. Why only Darren sensors? Because we had their sensor specifications. She said it without particular emphasis, as though it were obvious, as though having the sensor specifications of a hegemony that had been in diplomatic silence for 11 years were an ordinary logistical detail. Veth Kalos breathed in slowly. How long have you had their specifications? Long enough. Lieutenant Commander. She met his eyes, long enough to build something that works. He looked at the web. 600 million kilometers of ghost emitters, assembled piece by piece in a food processing bay, smuggled across 9 systems in ordinary cargo containers, deployed by 5 ships that were officially standing still. How long did this take to build? He asked. The infrastructure, about 8 months. She paused. The plan, longer. How much longer? She looked at the display. Arbiter, can I ask you something? Yes. What was the compact afraid of, specifically, when you made the declaration? He considered the question honestly. Unpredictability. Specifically, your willingness to accept damage that would terminate any rational species engagement. Your documented tendency to continue operating in conditions that should produce either surrender or collapse. The assembly found this combination, unpredictability plus damage tolerance, to be inherently dangerous in a species with weapons access. Right, she nodded slowly. And what they missed, she said, is that unpredictability and damage tolerance aren't weapons problems. They're what you have instead of weapons when everyone keeps taking your weapons away. Silence. You've been building this since before the declaration, he said. We've been building this since the first time a compact member suggested we might be too difficult to manage. She said the phrase with precise intonation, the intonation of someone quoting something that was said in their presence without realizing they were being listened to. That was about 2 years ago, in a closed session that was supposed to be classified. You have a source in the assembly. We have people who pay attention. The communications array, he said, the one in the undocumented room, the one that could reach 11 of 14 inhabited systems. We have people who pay attention, she said again, and this time the words had a different weight. Arbiter, we've been watching the political architecture of this situation for 3 years. We knew the declaration was likely 18 months out. We knew the Dyran repositioning was happening, not what their target was, but that they were building towards something. We put the two things together. You concluded the declaration would leave the compact vulnerable. We concluded someone might conclude the declaration would leave the compact vulnerable, and decided to fill the gap before it appeared. We decided to fill it quietly, she said, without telling anyone, without asking permission, without making it anyone's political problem. Just, she moved her hand through the display and the web lit up in full detail. Quietly. He stared at the web for a long time. Then he said very carefully, the inspection. She waited. The inspection was designed to be documented. You wanted me to find the anomalies. You wanted the directorate to have a record of things they couldn't explain. Still waiting. If the Dyran fleet breaks through, he said, the compact needs to be able to say that humans helped without being asked, despite being declared hazardous, using methods that evade detection and appear impossible. You wanted that on record, because if you survive this, you want to renegotiate the declaration from a position of demonstrated value, she said. Not leverage, value. There's a difference. Is there? Leverage implies threat. We're not threatening anyone. A pause. We're just very good at making sure people understand what the world would look like without us. Veth Kalos stood very still for a moment. Then he said, the notebook. What did the younger observer write during the declaration? Kasha Oren almost smiled. She wrote, timeline moves up, begin phase 2. The Dyran advance fleet hit the web approximately 30 hours, after Veth Kalos's arrival at Meridian. He watched it from the operations room, watched on the display as 314 vessels entered the Veth corridor and began to slow. They weren't stopping. The web wasn't designed to stop them. It was designed to make every meter of forward progress require a calculation, a course adjustment, a sensor verification. 314 vessels, each one running constant navigational checks against a stellar topology that didn't exist, each one adding friction to an advance that had been designed for overwhelming speed. The compact's repositioning ETA when the Dyran had entered the corridor, 280 hours. The web, at maximum efficiency, could buy approximately 290. 20 hours of margin for the defense of 14 inhabited systems. It won't hold the full time, Kasia said. She was standing next to him watching the display. Her voice was level. They'll start figuring out the emitter frequency pattern in about 60 hours. Once they crack it, they can filter. After that, transit time drops significantly. How significantly? From 290 to maybe 180. 100 hours short. He felt the math settle in his chest like something cold. Then what's the plan? He asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the display, at the web, at the slow grinding progress of the Dyran fleet through a maze of false stars. Ensign Murin, she called. Kale Murin appeared from the left side of the room. Commander. Show the Arbiter the second phase. The display shifted. The web remained, but new elements appeared, marked in a different color than the installed infrastructure, marked in the red that the display's legend listed as asterisk active deployment. 42 registered human vessels, 37 visible, 5 previously phantom, all of them moving. Not toward the Dyran fleet. Away from it. Moving to positions along the corridor's perimeter, the gravitational boundary where the transit lanes met open space. You're not fighting them, Veth Kalos said. We can't fight 314 warships, she said. What we can do is something none of them are expecting. She looked at the display. When they crack the emitter frequency, which they will, they'll be able to filter the false stars, but they won't be able to filter real ones. What are your ships going to do at the corridor boundary? 7 of them have modified traction arrays, she said. Deep gravity manipulation. Mining equipment. Originally, we have a lot of asteroid extraction history. The modifications allow them to move objects, not large objects, but in this particular stretch of the corridor, there are about 400 small bodies, rocks, debris clusters, pieces of an old gas cloud. Most of them are in stable positions. She paused. Stable-ish. He looked at the display. He saw the debris fields. He saw the positions of the 7 vessels. He saw, with a growing and complicated feeling, exactly what she was describing. You're going to make the corridor impassable, he said. We're going to make it difficult, she said. Impassable is not actually achievable by 7 ships with mining equipment, but difficult we can do. Every debris cluster we shift adds navigation time. If we hit the right gravitational nodes, we can create cascades, chain reactions, small bodies displacing larger ones. What happens to your 7 ships while they're doing this? They have to work close to the advancing fleet. How close? Kale Murin was very quiet on the other side of the room. Close enough to work the gravity fields, Kasia said. They'll be targeted. Yes. Your ship's defensive capabilities under the declaration are. Class 3, yes. Veth Kalos understood then what she had not said. 7 ships with Class 3 defensive ratings, operating within targeting range of a fleet of 314 warships, moving debris fields as fast as they could while those warships tried to stop them. They would not last long. How long do the 7 ships buy? He asked. At optimistic estimate, 60 hours. And pessimistic. She looked at him steadily. Enough. Lieutenant Commander, your people know what they're doing, she said. Do they know they're likely to? Arbiter, her voice was not harsh. It was something harder to describe than harsh. It was the voice of a person standing in a place they reached by their own choosing, speaking from a position so decided that the deciding was already in the past. They volunteered, every one of them. I didn't assign this. He looked at the display. At 7 small markers moving into position near the slow-grinding bulk of 314 warships. Who is commanding the 7 ships? He asked. I am, said Kale Murin from across the room. Veth Kalos turned. The ensign was looking at the display with the same focused calm he'd shown at the docking collar. He was 23 years old, approximately, by human standards. He was holding a coffee cup and looking at the projected positions of 7 ships he was about to take into weapons range of a fleet 30 times larger. You're very young, Veth Kalos said. I know the corridor better than anyone on the station, Kale said. I've run it 14 times. I know every debris field. Why 14 times? Kale Murin smiled, and for the first time Veth Kalos saw something behind the focused calm, not recklessness, not the romanticized death hunger of stories, but something quieter and more permanent. A man who had made a decision so deeply that it had stopped being a decision and become simply a fact about himself. Because Commander Oren told me it would matter, he said. The 7 ships deployed 16 hours later. Veth Kalos watched from the operations room as they took their positions along the corridor's edge. He watched the Dyran fleet registers light up on the tactical display, the warships detecting the movement, adjusting formation, beginning to track. How long before they're in range? He asked. They're already in range, said the tactical officer without looking up. He looked at Kasia. She was watching the display with her hands still. How long until the compact fleet can engage? She asked. Repositioning ETA is currently 204 hours, said the tactical officer. A pause. So we need about 140 hours total from the web and the Phase 2 deployment. Commander, the web bought us 30 hours already. We need another 110 from the 7 ships. That's the plan, she said. Against 314 warships with Class 3 defensive capability. That is the plan. She said it without heat, without the kind of emphasis people use when they need others to believe them. The emphasis of certainty which doesn't need volume. The math isn't pretty, but it's the math. Veth Kalos thought of something. A detail that had been sitting in the back of his notes, unconnected to anything else until this moment. The hidden room, he said. The library, the communications array that reaches 11 systems. She looked at him. The children, the families, he paused. If those rooms have 6 months of supplies. We have people elsewhere too, she said quietly. The 42 registered vessels aren't the only things we have in space right now. He thought about that. You evacuated. We've been moving vulnerable populations for 9 months, quietly, in small groups, using transport vessels making routine runs. She looked at the display. There are about 4,000 humans currently aboard compact stations, in transit, in positions spread across 9 systems, in places that aren't in the Dyran's path. 4,000, he said. Your total population aboard vessels and stations was 47,000, yes, she said it simply. 47,000 to 4,000. The movement of 43,000 people across 9 systems over 9 months, completely invisible to compact oversight. We didn't move everyone. Some people didn't want to go. Some are on the 7 ships. Why would anyone stay on the 7 ships? She looked at the display. Arbiter, we are not asking the compact to defend us. We are not asking you to risk your people for hours. What we are doing, what we've been doing for 9 months is making sure that whatever happens in the next 100 hours, the people who survive it can keep going. A beat. That's always been the plan. Not to win. not to defeat the Dyran, just to keep going long enough for someone else to catch up. She turned back to the display, where 7 small markers were beginning to move the first debris clusters. "Our species," she said, "has exactly one survival strategy, and it isn't winning. It's refusing to finish losing until the situation changes." Kale Murin's 7 ships worked for 31 hours before the Dyran focused fire. In those 31 hours, they moved 48 major debris clusters, triggering 9 cascade events that collapsed 3 transit lanes entirely, and forced the Dyran advance fleet to navigate a corridor that was, in practice, no longer the same corridor it had been when they entered. The Compact's tactical analysts, watching in real time via relay from Meridian's communications array, calculated afterward that the debris repositioning had added a minimum of 122 hours of navigational difficulty to the Dyran advance. 122 hours, from 7 ships with mining equipment. When the Dyran focused fire, 2 of the ships were already deep in the debris field, working a large cluster near the second transit lane. They saw the weapons lock on tactical. Vethkalos watched the display. He watched for a long time. Of the 7 ships, 4 made it back to the corridor's edge, 3 did not. Kale Murin's ship was not among the 4. The operations room was quiet for a long time after the markers went still. Kasia stood at the display. She didn't move. She had the face of a person who had known this was coming and had decided that knowing it in advance was the only honest thing she could offer those 3 ships, because she could not offer them safety. Vethkalos stood beside her. He didn't speak. There was nothing in his vocabulary of compact diplomacy that covered this moment. The silence that follows a sacrifice you watched coming from the beginning and couldn't prevent, and didn't stop, because stopping it would have meant something worse. Finally she said, 153 hours total, Web plus Phase 2. Yes, the compact fleet needed 204 hours. They had bought 153. 51 hours short. What happens now? He asked. She turned to the remaining tactical officer. What assets do we have in the corridor that haven't been committed? Commander, the officer checked. We have 39 of the original 42 registered vessels. 3 were committed in Phase 2 and are returning. Non-combatant configuration. Class 3 defensive rating. A pause. That's it. The 4,000 people on compact stations, Vethkalos said carefully. In transit, spread across 9 systems. Kasia looked at him. They're transports, he said. Configuration. Non-combatant. But functional, moving, capable of entering the corridor. Arbiter. Capable, he said, of doing what 7 ships already demonstrated, at smaller scale, by a larger number. You're describing sending civilian transports carrying 4,000 people into. No, he said, I'm describing 4,000 people and their commanders deciding for themselves what they do next. He looked at the display. The Compact has 41 warships repositioning as fast as they can. The humans in this corridor have bought us 153 hours. We need 51 more. He looked at her. I cannot order your people to do anything. That has never been clearer to me than it is right now, but I can ask. She looked at him for a long time. You understand, she said, that if you're asking and they agree, that's not something the Compact can later call reckless. That's not something you can use in the next declaration. There won't be another declaration. Arbiter. There will not, he said, be another declaration. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to her communication station and opened a channel to 9 systems simultaneously. What she said to 4,000 people spread across the dark between stars, Vethkalos heard in full. She didn't order. She didn't command. She told them what had happened in the corridor, what Kale Murin's 7 ships had done, what 51 more hours would mean, and what she was asking. She told them they didn't have to. She told them the odds clearly. She told them she would think no less of anyone who chose differently. Then she waited. The responses came back over the next 4 minutes, from 9 systems, from 4,000 people in 31 transports carrying mining equipment and cargo containers and emergency supplies, and in several cases, physical books. Every transport said yes. The 31 transports entered the Veth corridor 6 hours later. They didn't fight. They had nothing to fight with. What they did was what the 7 ships had done: move debris, shift gravity fields, deepen the maze, except they did it in 31 places at once, scattered across the entire length of the corridor, each transport moving what it could reach, and then repositioning before the Dairon tracking systems could fix on it. The Dairon commander, according to signals intelligence the compact was able to intercept, had called for a full tactical review at hour 72 of the advance. He had begun the campaign expecting to pass through the Veth corridor in 40 hours. He was now approaching hour 90 and had covered less than 30% of the distance. He issued a new order: maximum firepower on any moving object in the corridor, regardless of apparent threat level. The transports, moving at civilian speed through a field of debris and false sensor ghosts, took losses. Veth Kalos watched the display and stopped counting after the 5th marker went still, because counting was beginning to do something to him that he didn't have language for. He was watching a species that had been declared too dangerous to arm stand between 314 warships and 14 inhabited systems using mining equipment, false stars, and the specific human characteristic that had gotten them declared dangerous in the first place: the inability to assess a situation as unwinnable and stop. They weren't winning. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to not finish losing. At hour 47, the compact's advance fleet entered the corridor's far end. The Dairon commander received a new contact report: 41 compact warships, fully armed, coming from a direction that the original advance timeline had guaranteed would be empty. The corridor behind him was no longer passable. The debris had been resettled into configurations that would take weeks to clear. He had 41 warships in front and a maze behind. He had 314 ships, and he had the math, and the math was still in his favor. But the math had been in his favor at the beginning, when he had 40 hours to pass through a clear corridor. He issued the order to engage the compact fleet. The battle took 11 hours. Veth Kalos did not watch most of it, not because he couldn't, but because the display in the operations room had been given over entirely to the human transports still working the corridor's debris field, trying to get home, and he found he couldn't look at anything else. 22 of the 31 transports made it back out. The compact issued a statement 3 days after the battle. Veth Kalos read it in the operations room of Meridian Station, standing next to Kasha Oren, who read it at the same time in silence. The statement cited human assistance as *instrumental to compact survival *. It announced a formal review of the Category 7 psychological hazard classification. It extended provisional diplomatic partnership status to humanity pending a full assembly session. It did not mention the names of any ships. It did not name Kale Murin. It did not list the 26 vessels that hadn't come back, or the people who had been in them, or the 9 months of quiet planning, or the boy with the calm dark eyes in an undocumented room, or the 4,000 people who had answered a question they weren't required to answer. It mentioned, in the 3rd paragraph, that the compact's arms regulation framework would need to be updated to reflect new strategic realities. Veth Kalos read the statement twice. Then he took out his notebook. He wrote a formal response on behalf of the Directorate, cooperative, professional, appropriately worded. He sent it. Then he sat for a long time, with the notebook open to a blank page. He thought about the empty locker with the sealed locks. He thought about the notebook he'd never seen. He thought about 11 anomalies classified as inconclusive. He thought about a communications array in an undocumented room, and 47,000 people moved to safety in 9 months without anyone noticing, and 31 transports that said yes without hesitation. He thought about Kasha saying we have exactly one survival strategy, refusing to finish losing until the situation changes. He thought about what it meant that they had planned all of this from the beginning, not as a response to the declaration, as an anticipation of it, as though they had known, long before the Compact knew, what the Compact would decide and had decided with the same quiet certainty what they would do about it. He thought about Cale Murin at 23, holding a coffee cup, having run the corridor 14 times because someone told him it would matter. He opened his notebook and wrote. Not a formal report, not an anomaly log, just the thing he had been trying to say clearly for 8 days. The Compact declared them dangerous because they will not stop. We saw it as a flaw, a liability, a reason for restriction. We were wrong about what we were seeing. The unwillingness to stop is not dangerous to us. It was dangerous for us. They spent 11 months building a system designed to save civilizations that had voted to disarm them, using methods we couldn't detect, accepting losses we couldn't prevent, for an outcome they didn't benefit from directly. They didn't do this because they forgave us the declaration. They did this because they decided, before the declaration happened, that this was who they were going to be regardless of what we did. He stopped, read it back, added one more line smaller in the margin, the way he always put the truest things. We were afraid of what they might become if we gave them weapons. We never considered what they already were without them. He saw Kasha one more time before he left Meridian Station. She was in the docking bay, overseeing the return of one of the surviving transports. The crew was coming down the gangway, a mix of ages, faces carrying the particular exhausted quality of people who had been past the edge of what they could bear and had come back from it with something changed, something quieter. She was speaking to each of them, just a few words each. He couldn't hear what she said from across the bay. He crossed to her when the last crew member had passed. "I'm heading back to the Directorate," he said. "Safe travel, Arbiter." He paused, the boy in the undocumented room with the book. She waited. "Is he?" "He's on one of the outpost stations. Safe." Something shifted in her expression, small, quick, privately human. "He's 12, actually, not 16. He's just very composed for his age." "He knew I was the Arbiter. We showed everyone your photo. We wanted to make sure no one seemed surprised." A pause. "He was the only one who asked about you afterward, what you were like." "What did you tell him?" She looked at him for a moment. "I told him you paid attention." He nodded once. "There's one thing I never understood," he said. "The empty locker. The inspection's first morning, how was it empty? The seals were engaged. The logs showed no access." She looked at him with that same steady, cooperative expression. He had been trying to read for 12 days. "The items in that locker," she said, "were not items that appeared on any registered inventory." "I know. So they weren't subject to the declaration." "Technically, but the seals." "The seals," she said, "were engaged from the inside." He stared at her. "Someone was in there," he said. "Someone had been in there," she corrected. "Before we knew you were coming, we moved everything we needed to move. The seals engaged automatically when the last person left. There was a passage to Sublevel 2 that's not on the official schematics." "The schematics you provided." "The schematics required by Compact regulation," she said, "which specified documentation of all structural elements above a certain dimensional threshold. The passage is 14 centimeters wide." He thought about what kind of person could fit through a passage 14 centimeters wide. He thought about what kind of species builds passages 14 centimeters wide in the first place. He thought about what they moved through them. He thought about 9 months and 47,000 people, and 31 transports saying yes, and a communications array in a hidden room, and a web of false stars across 600 million kilometers of space. "How long," he said carefully, "were you planning this?" She tilted her head, exactly the way she had in the assembly gallery, filing the question under a category she already had a name for. "Arbiter," she said, "we've been planning this since the first time someone told us we were too dangerous to be trusted." He held her gaze. "I'll see you at the assembly session," he said finally. "We'll be there," she said. He walked back across the docking bay. At the corridor entrance he stopped and turned back once. She was already focused on the transport, already working, already moving through some next phase of a plan he was only ever going to understand in retrospect. He went back to his ship. He did not sleep on the way home. He sat at the viewport and looked at the stars, which were real, which did not emit false gravity signatures, which were what they appeared to be. He thought about a species that had spent so much of its existence being told it was dangerous that it had become very good at something else, becoming indispensable. Not through power, not through size, not through the accumulated advantage of a civilization that had never been threatened into a corner, but through the particular discipline of a species that had looked at every corner it was ever backed into and begun, immediately and without resentment, measuring the walls. The galaxy had declared them too dangerous to arm. It had been correct, he thought, just not in the way it intended. They were too dangerous to arm, because they didn't need to be armed to be dangerous. And somewhere in the dark between systems, 22 transports were making their way home through a corridor full of debris that hadn't been there a week ago, carrying people who had said yes because someone had asked honestly, and because they had decided, a long time ago and very quietly, what kind of thing they were going to be when the moment came. Not the strongest, not the largest, not the best equipped or the most feared or the most protected. Just the ones who were still there, still moving, still building 14-centimeter passages in walls everyone else had stopped looking at, still running corridors they knew would matter, still saying yes to questions that offered them nothing but the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of having been the ones who did not stop. That was all. That had always been all. And it had always been enough.